So Francis Fukuyama talks about how there seems to be this, decay in the translatio imperii of history and of sort of the tale of history, as though we're, properly a part of this sort of story of mankind's triumphs over different things, in large part because of the disillusionment, in large part because of how seemingly capitalism seems to have won out over communism in the 20th century's Cold Wars, and about a lot of disillusionment with the experimentations of different regimes in the 20th century, such as Stalinist communism, the Nazis, things like this. The sort of these different regimes throughout history, particularly in the 20th century, when they sort of came to this grand experiment fever pitch. And that's why, in part, we find ourselves in the 21st century sort of weird, like, end of history disillusionment, where it's this kind of neoliberal, like, oh, let's just go to the grocery store on the weekends after our 9 to 5s, and go to dive bars and watch sort of, not feel like we're a part of sort of the journey and the experiment of history anymore. So, because, there is this interesting uniqueness to the 21st century that it is sort of ahistorical. That, you look at the TV and all the shows and all the documentaries and all these Romans, they were in their historical time, but no, not you. You're kind of a loser, right? You gotta go get a job and then, go shop for some plastic wrap at Dollar Tree. And so it's interesting to actually read that other people sort of feel that way too, and have documented that since the 90s and, of course, before. And one interpretation of a lot of this stuff is Francis Fukuyama's End of History and The Last Man. These are interesting books to, I think, juxtapose and also synthesize, because you're looking at, basically, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan is, of course, oftentimes taken as a kind of, because it's Enlightenment literature and because the idea is that the U.S., the one, the only, was made at the time of the Enlightenment as like a country with the Revolutionary War of '76, and Hobbes is therefore this Enlightenment author. The idea is, to a certain extent, obviously the Founding Fathers were looking at this guy and some others as a means of making the United States. And so it's like, oh, reading Hobbes' Leviathan is an interesting statecraft author and lecture. On the flip side, you also have the fact that End of History and The Last Man is, of course, the failures of regime building. So it's actually very interesting to try to juxtapose and synthesize these books. But so Small's Noodle, tell me your thoughts.
On, like, the whole thing, or in terms of, like which,
Well, we could of course have an interesting tangible start. Like, I know you and I talked about Thomas Hobbes, like a week or so ago when you were asking me about what I was reading about him.
Yeah, because I'm interested in what you learn. I actually don't talk about, that. I like talking about Thomas More.
Okay.
And he is a very interesting person, because he wrote, if you've ever read the book Utopia, it's a very progressive book of his time. For someone who hated heretics, men and women were equal in his book. He was a advisor to King Henry VIII, when he became king, to the point when Henry killed him. So he has been a advisor for a very long time. I think before he was an advisor, he was a lawyer. He was a really good lawyer, and then he became the advisory for Henry, and then ended up dying in his employ. But the thing is like, his book is so progressive, because the man is, and I say this because it's surprising. This is a white Catholic man in Tudor King Henry England, by the way. And the most his famous book is where men and women are created equal in a utopia. Isn't that ironic? Isn't that interesting that this man from Tudor England has similar views to modern day like people? It's interesting.
It sort of shows you, I think, in a sense, and like maybe this is too idealistic on me, I don't know. But I feel like a lot of times, in a certain sense, we sort of look back at old periods of time, and within a lot of people were like superstitious or dumb. But I think what it was is it was the social norms of their time. Like, he clearly grew up in some kind of sexist period, and I think it was expected. It was this norm that like women and men had this sort of drawing about their differences, I think, you know, like a lot of, we sort of look back and think a lot of older people of like historical time periods were like superstitious and silly. But I think that was just because that was sort of the norms. Like, that was their culture. That was like this expectation. And I think here what he's doing maybe with Utopia is he's sort of playing with, oh, what if we lived in an alternate reality where the norms were different? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book. I highly suggest you read it in your statecraft.
Yeah.
Because it's, and I hate to keep you have to, when you read it, you have to understand like the context in which he has written it. Like, he probably has some sexist undertones, even though it's a utopia, you know, that he has created. So there's probably some, you know, outdated views in the book, or outdated implied views, as much as he probably try to be progressive with it.
So, like, even outdated solutions, you might say.
I haven't read the book yet. I want to, because I find because I'm saying this because I don't want people to read it and then they be like, well, he says this here, you know? So I'm like, please remember, this man is from Tudor England, where women were expected to marry and have babies, and you could be nothing but Catholic. So I'm like, please remember the history of this so you can have that context when you read it. Because, like, I think sometimes people read, like, really old books, like, from philosophers from, like, 1800s, and then they'll see, like, an outdated view, and they're like, oh my god, what? And I'm like, do you not remember when this was written? Why are you clutching your pearls? Like, of course a man from 1805 is going to be like, what are women doing having opinions?
Yeah.
Like I don't know why you're surprised by it. Like, it's...
Although, to be fair, sometimes people think that today. Yeah.
Well, it's weird to me when people read philosophy books from people who were born in 1799 and then write a book in like 1835, and it's like, we believe in slavery and women only exist for us to have children. And people clutch your and I'm like, look at when this man was born. Look at where he was born, look at when he was born. Why are you surprised that this man has these beliefs? And you could come out and say, well, small doodle, not everyone of that time believed in it. No. And that's true.
But they had to have been some kind of outlier.
But they were out. There was a lot of the ones who weren't racist, who weren't bigots. A lot of them are not going to be in the history books because they were regular fucking people.
Yep.
Who...
I passed out in the mines. You know what that means.
I mean, you're gonna lose money.
I have 14,000, so now I'm down to 13,000.
Interesting.
Oh, well, I still have my stuff.
But, you know, like, a lot of the people who most likely were a lot more abolitionist than we know of were probably regular people who just helped with the Underground Railroad. Who didn't feel, who, like, I'm not writing a book.
Yeah.
So, like, the ones who did write a book either had the money to and were able to, and that's good or bad views. And that's like half of the thing I think is very interesting.